Cool. Recording in progress. Brilliant. Well, thanks. And thanks everyone for coming along. It's so lovely to just see human faces. It's still such a novelty, but it's lovely to see you all. So quickly, I'm not sure if you snuck in, I'll just spam the chat with this. There's some links it's the same link. It's just for today's stuff. It's like the slides from today, some questions and like a little workshopy and cheat sheet sort of thing. And I think that's all, and a data set that we can play with a little later on today. We can, we should try and tidy something up and put our skills into action. So I'll share my screen and we'll just sync right in. Boot that up. Cool. And also feel free to just chat and interrupt anytime. You can put your little hand up if you've got something, and it can be hard when I'm sharing screen to see it. So also jump in the chat or just interrupt me if you can squeeze a word in. I'm happy to wander off in tangents and chat all we need to. Yeah, so welcome. And today is the first in a few. We're not actually using R today, really. We'll talk about it, but we won't get too hands-on, but it's the first in our little reproducible research R workshop, and this material is just shamelessly pilfered from an undergraduate, a fourth year unit that I run and that I built at Sydney, which is focused on introducing, it's like an intensive little unit that we use to teach principles of data science and how to use code and all that kind of stuff to beginning researchers, honors students, but we often get lots of grad students and whatnot as well. So nice to meet you all. I actually know some faces here. It's lovely to see you, but if not, my name's Tom. I'm at Sydney Uni, and I work in I run the Evolutionary and Sensory Ecology Lab, where we do kind of anything on weird invertebrates. We're particularly interested in communication and I guess information in a general sense. So we do a lot of work trying to understand how organisms gather and weigh information and make sense of all this noise out there and separate the signal from it to make important decisions, all those important decisions like finding good food and not getting eaten, finding mates and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of behavior kind of work and bits of physiology as well, particularly vision and visual communication. And we also do some kind of quantitative fun stuff like meta-analyses and modeling, trying to understand how to represent how animals and organisms perceive the world around them. But today, so there are outcomes because I pinched this from a unit. So we do have outcomes each week. This week's outcomes, we are interested in maybe chatting a bit about the principles, just the kind of broader introduction to, I guess, reproducibility and open science and what that might mean for us. And just as a fairly gentle introduction into some key steps and some foundations we might lay for creating digital projects that are themselves nice and reproducible and of maximum value to our future selves, to other people, to collaborators. And in practical terms, so we'll create and detail the structure of a little tidy project, tidy digital project, tidy data sets and what that might mean, and tidy code and what that might mean as well. And so these are it's a little foundation that we can lay, and then in the next few weeks, we'll just be building on that. So when we write our code, we'll do so in a nice, tidy sort of way, and it'll help us build feedback into those projects that are useful to ourselves and to others well into the future. So we can start, I typically start these things with just a brief discussion about why we might even care about this kind of thing and what we might be shooting for in learning these tools, because there is a bit of a learning curve with all this stuff. So why even bother? I guess philosophically, we can think, something small like, what is science? And I guess increasingly you might hear about this idea of open science, and really it's just science. And I guess if you think about it, it's, the practice of making everything that we do as useful and open and transparent as possible so that it can be built on, incrementally, which is basically how science advances. We read about this cool work, we take it a little step further, we build on it, and we do that with our own work. We're always building and growing. We do that with others, of course. And in a sense, that is just kind of the next natural step. and what we think of as the scientific process, but we do have to, I guess you hear it distinguished as open science, because nowadays we can do things like, share our data in new ways. We can use code, which is increasingly common, to really document every single step of the way. And so it can be open in a way that previously was much less common and often not possible to do without the tools that we now have at hand and the simple computational tools that we've got. So in thinking about what makes science as useful as possible, I guess, or features of robust science, as I call it, a couple of concepts that we might bump into. One is that of reproducibility, and another is that of replicability. So reproducibility is just the idea that a given result, so the product of your work, can be independently reached given the same data and analyses. So if I run a study, I provide someone with the data and the code, say they should be able to reproduce the results and everything that I report in my, in my paper, in my work. So that would be a nice reproducible study or analysis. It's slightly different from a replicable bit of science, which would be that the same results can be independently reached given a whole new data set and a whole new analysis pipeline. So if someone just takes the methods that I described very well for them and a framework, and they essentially rerun it, and if they come to roughly the same conclusion, the same results, that would be that example of a replicable piece of science. The two are closely related. For the sake of this, and in the future weeks and the next few weeks, we're really focused on this reproducible aspect of science and how we get there, because it is kind of the foundation. If something's irreproducible, it's very unlikely to be replicable. So it kind of lays the groundwork, and it's also the most immediately, it's just a sensible place to start for our own work, even just in terms of making sure that the work that we do is most useful to us, again, in the future. And so we tend to focus a little bit more on reproducibility, but these are just subtle concepts that will come up through our discussions and our chats as we go on. And then we can go on and think about, well, why might we be terribly interested in this? Kind of from both a broad perspective and maybe a more focused one in terms of just, what good is it for me personally? None of this is completely black and white, so I'm just presenting some arguments for why we might be interested here, with not a great deal of nuance. I fully appreciate we all work under our own constraints and have our own ideas on these things. But one view is that this is just basically, nice, robust, reproducible science is really just what science is and should be. To science, in a general sense, is a public good, irrespective in some ways of who you're particularly funded by. I guess in a nice, naive, perfect, a perfect world, the science that we do is ultimately for the public good and for the advancement of human understanding and knowledge. And so the work that we do, it deserves to be, it's presented in its most useful state. So we want it to have maximum utility and reach and impact. And so by creating reproducible little packages, it just simply helps us towards that goal. It's useful to us, again, in the future. It's useful to all those that may serve to benefit from the hard work that we do. And it takes a ton of work, to get a little study together and create a little paper. And so it deserves to be see its maximum potential and reach. You deserve it. Everyone that reads your work and wants to make use of your work deserves it as well. Some other reasons are we kind of want to be building on sturdy foundations. There's lots of talk in particular fields as well, like you may have heard of the reproducibility crisis in social sciences. It's hard to, it's a constant battle to figure out what's reliable and what we should really chase and build use as the foundations for our future work. And what perhaps we shouldn't. And part of dealing with that is simply creating these reproducible little packages. If we have access to data, if we have access to the code, if we can see how people got from A to B to C in a nice, open, transparent way, it just makes it that much more easy for us to assess the quality of work and how much weight we should give to these things, and how much time we should dedicate to building off these results. In an applied sense, it's kind of, I guess, a blue sky sort of sense, but it's also applied as well, because often we need to actually make something, build something in the real world that has real world consequences. And so we need to be able to robustly assess the quality of science that we're working with. And again, it's just moving towards that goal in that much more of a robust way. Can have real life consequences. You'll see this is even, I guess, slightly outdated now. The latest one is all about, I guess, ivermectin, these kind of things, but we're constantly awash with diverse, noisy, messy information out there in the world, and we need to make sense of it. And so it just, I mean, you can almost think of really papers are just kind of like people just tell it, they're like advertisements, right? So you read a paper and it's like, hey, I did this thing, take my word for it, you know, here are the results, take my word for it, I swear. But really it's just an ad, like the hard work and really what you've produced is data. There's empirical insight into a phenomenon. The really juicy good stuff is in those data that you produced. And then you kind of wrap it up in this lovely advertisement, which is your paper itself. But without that, and without the mapping of one to the other, it can be increasingly tricky, especially in these really, I guess, high risk, you know, high consequence sort of situations, to just take those things at face value, especially when they're really important real world consequences as well. Which is why, you know, it's just that much more important, that much more useful if we can really dive in, see how things were actually done, how A leads to B leads to C. Again, there's like a lifetime of examples of this kind of thing. This is just a little one of, say, some improper data handling and documentation and whatnot. This was some tests being run, some COVID-19 tests being run in the UK, and they had pretty poor data handling processes. So they would tack the results of COVID tests onto this spreadsheet in their little back end of their system, but they were using some ancient version of Excel, some incorrect formatting thing, and so it basically tanked out it was limited to the maximum number of rows of like 50,000, which equated to about 2,000 patients. So the first 2,000 patients got appended to this spreadsheet and the rest just vanished off into the ether. And so all these test results were just thrown into cyberspace and, you know, vanished essentially, all due to some poorly documented, you know, badly handled data, using the wrong tools for the job. And so that's kind of a very real world consequence of how these, you know, how these things, hopefully our work often isn't so life and death, which is merciful, but we do, and in, you know, this unit I run, people go off and become data scientists for all sorts of things. So it applies not just to the science that we do, but really anywhere in our life that we're handling raw information and seeking to make it useful off into the future. And then selfishly, which is, you know, a great reason to do anything, just for our own work, it's just easier once we have these nice little procedures in place that we'll learn a bit about. Much easier to share and reuse data because the projects themselves will just be lovely and self-contained and richly documented and detailed. We can chuck new stuff in there nice and easily. We can find mistakes in our thinking, in our handling of information, in our processing of it. And it's easier, there's a learning curve, but like once we get through, hopefully, you know, we're up to week 4 here and we learn how to use these cool things like R Markdown, it's much easier to actually revise and update stuff. So you've got your whole workflow there, nice and documented and integrated. It goes from data. You've got code that manipulates that data and turns it into a manuscript. If you need to say, throw out 20 values because you realize that they're a mistake, then you can just have a little line of code that does that. And the whole thing is just updated, all your tables or your figures, everything's just, you know, redone. None of this copying and pasting and introduction of more mistakes as we try and round to decimal figures and all that kind of stuff. And the whole thing is also self-documented. So the exact steps, you know, if we really integrate these tools, you can see you don't just have to take people's word for it. I'm sure we all constantly read papers where it's like, okay, p equals less than 1. I have no idea where that came from. Or like, I see that you described some vague model that you ran, then you report this result, but I can't, from that information you presented me with, I can't get from there to there. And it gets worse as you go back in time, right? These old papers from the 80s that we take as like foundational to these, empirical evidence for bits of theory that we're interested in. And you kind of dig through them, and often it's like, yeah, we did this thing, p equals less than 0.1. And you're like, cool, I'll just take your word for it because I have no idea what that really means. But by using these, working towards using some of these workflows, we can build an integrated little workflow that gets us to the point where we could go back and revisit a manuscript and see, oh, okay, so literally that's the bit of code that grabs that bit of data, that gives me that model, that gives me that R² value, that plonks into that table. So you can see the whole chain of manipulation and output. And so in that self-documenting sense, that kind of thing can just live for a very long time, and we will never be left with wondering what the heck we did to get where we are. You can reuse all this stuff as well. So we often just do things over and over again, so we can just pinch our own work and make sense of it. And once more and more people are on board, including some of your collaborators, there's a learning curve, but it actually can make life a lot easier in terms of collaborating on projects as well. And one thing I'll say is that the most important collaborator you have is your future self. So when I talk about collaborators as well, it can just be you in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year, coming back to the work that you do. It can just be, even if you just change tack for a week, I don't know about you, but I can completely just lose track of what I was doing on some given project. And so I have to relearn my own work. But by just making these part of your life and your natural workflow, you just dive back in and read it with fresh eyes as if you were coming to it for the first time, which functionally you often are if you're working on a bunch of stuff at different times. So there are two principles that will guide us today and for the next few weeks as well. One is that ideally someone unfamiliar with your project, and again, that could just be you in a week, should be able to look at your project, and your digital projects are really the set of files that you use on your computer to create a paper ultimately. And they should be able to understand it, what you did and why you did it really. And the second principle is that everything you do, you'll just have to do again at some point anyway. So we might as well build these workflows and tools that allow us to do that as simply as possible. Reviewers will get us to do stuff, we'll make mistakes, things will have to be done over and over again. So let's just make it as simple as possible from the get-go. And this is our little roadmap. And it's actually what we'll be doing for the next few weeks if you stick through or you dip in and out. Today, we're just interested in mostly in this. So laying that foundation, building tidy little projects, cleaning up our data. And then next week is transforming. So we'll be doing a bit of how to manipulate data, use R and these tidyverse tools to wrangle data into its most useful form. We're doing a bit of visualization, so how to use some ggplot2 to create nice publication quality plots, or and then so we're not doing modeling so much, we're not going to the stats. We'll touch on it and how to integrate this as part of our workflows, but we're not doing a dedicated stats week. We're jumping straight through to communication and learning some cool tools, particularly R Markdown, which is a lovely flexible way of writing papers and all sorts of other stuff. These slides are all written in R Markdown. So this is all R you're seeing here. My website is built in R Markdown. We can do lots of cool stuff with that. So that'll be our fourth week. So for today, laying those foundations, we're going to be touching on what is a tidy digital project and what might that look like? What do tidy data look like? How do we make them maximally useful? And what does tidy code look like? So those will just be our little 3 steps that we'll work through today over the next, hour and a half. And that's our roadmap. And I've left these exercises in. So again, this is for an undergrad course, but there's like a little handbook you'll see in your PDF there. So we can just use these as like natural breaks. If you need 5 minutes, grab a cup of tea or anything. Also, if questions pop up, by all means, is a good time to ask. And we can just use these as like discussion points, I think. So this first one, I typically ask people and just have a bit of a think about the kinds of stakeholders, I guess, why you're interested in these and learning some of these tools and these processes. And we just jot down some of the stakeholders that might be interested in the products of our work. I'm also just kind of interested in what you guys all do. And then we also have a chat about, we can think about, because it's not, I just throw this out there, you know, in 15 minutes, we should all just do this and make our code available and our data available. But it's not without, you know, justified. It's scary in some ways as well. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I certainly, I do share my data and code, but like it took me a while to get there, and it's not, yeah, it's not like, it's not nothing. I get it's still a bit nerve-wracking because, you know, what if people like just want to tear me down and dig through all my stuff, or like, what if they, I don't know, what if they pinch it, or, you know, all sorts of things. So it's not without, it doesn't warrant, it does warrant, sorry, some thought as to the upsides and downsides and where you might sit and be interested in these things. And so there's a couple of things to think about, and we can take a couple of minutes. Thanks. I don't know if anyone has perspectives on, oops, sorry, get rid of that. There we are. Do people like, do you guys share, you know, how open are things for you at the moment? Are you comfortable? I guess increasingly we're mandated to share things like data. So you'll have seen that might be increasingly just part and parcel of the work that you do. In which case, you know, if you're already at that step, that's cool. And we'll hopefully some tips in here might help you make it even more useful and reusable into the future. But yeah, does anyone have like experience or upsides or downsides or anything like that they've come across? I guess some of the big fears are things like, you know, people tearing you down. Is well justified? I don't know.
I mean, I think you have to, with the publication process, share code now. So I mean, you have to get used to it. But it can be useful if reviewers then take your code and can run it and can actually use it to make useful review comments during the publication process. That's when it saves everybody a whole heap of time, because you can actually see what you're arguing about rather than misinterpreting things. But yeah, I mean, you have to be incredibly confident about what you're doing to be able to share it with an educated audience and be prepared to take the criticism. Often I'm relying on students as well, so I'm trying to keep up with what they're doing as well as, you know, keep up with my own skills. So that's just my perspective.
No, I think that's spot on, and it's, yeah, it's a good point about making it available for reviewers too. I do that, and I've only had positive experiences so far. So I make everything I just mint it and make it publicly available at the review process, so that reviewers can just click on that and then go and see, like, actually, let's see if I can find an example. And I also stick it all on my website here, so you can go into a paper, you know, that I've published and click on data here, and then, all right, so here's a bit of here's how you might navigate these files and what you expect to find. I've got all the raw data here. I've got the R code that runs the analyses, and it's commented in here. So ideally a reviewer, which, you know, in this case they did, you know, some people went through and poked on things and said, oh, why don't you think about this instead of that? And it's kind of scary, but I don't know, ultimately, yeah, it is scary, but ultimately, if I make mistakes, I ideally just want them to be caught at that stage. So I you know, think go for it. Despite the fact that I would, you know, it can be confronting when people are like, oh, you've screwed this up. But that's a good time to catch it. But yeah, it's not without its well justified nerves going into it all. And there's a lot we kind of need to be semi-experts on, because you're right that people do now ask for code as well as, you know, all these nice data sets. And so you're like, well, do I understand how this generalized linear model function works well enough? Am I confident that this is exactly right and whatnot? So there are a few different points at which we can, you know, might have some apprehension going into it. But yeah, I think increasingly it just is, in practical terms, is the way things are obviously going as well. And journals and universities and everything are increasingly nervous just about reproducibility themselves, with all these little cases you see popping up about mass retractions and this and that. I mean, it's just, for the sake of it's going that way anyway. So let's just get ahead of the curve and be a bit more confident in how we do these things. Could also be another way of looking at it. But yeah.
I also agree with like sharing the data and code, but I find it's something minor but not very important. But I find I feel a bit embarrassed when I'm sharing the code that I don't know how to write loop or function, and I will have many repeated lines that looks not professional, but it still work.
No, that's totally fair, and I completely understand that as well. And I go back to my own stuff, and I'm like, yeah, I could have spent another week and like vectorize this and run it in parallel. Or honestly, it's such a huge step from going from nothing, you know, just to having the code there. I think I completely understand that, but I think by and large, I've found people, and certainly I am, just understanding that I'm not a professional programmer, and most of us aren't. These are just one of a dozen things that we need to be experts at somehow. So I think it's totally fine. I find it very charming when you find a bit of code and it's just 10 lines copied and pasted with a different variable name or whatever. Like, if it works, it works. And if it gets the result there, and that's infinitely more transparent than just no code whatsoever. And someone just saying, I did this thing, you know, but here I can at least see it, and you went from there and whatever, you copied and pasted 10 times and went there. That's still great. So
yeah, getting the code correct is the most important thing.
Yeah, as long as it's right, you know, clean and tidy, whatever, you know, that's something we can all just chip away at. But correctness, yeah, I suppose is the main thing. But yeah, that's a good one. It's kind of another thing to be, I don't know, judged on or worried about being judged on. But
yeah, I joined Louis in that in that experience.
yeah.
I have had the same experience, but also I guess not only that you feel like kind of a bit shy, but also sometimes I just feel that I don't have the knowledge to make it so pretty.
Yeah.
And it takes me so long to, I think like it takes me double than actually running the code. And I'm like, well, I wish I could do it faster and pretty so that it's ready for publication. But then, yeah, like I guess most of the time our workshops are either very advanced or very basic.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to catch up in that.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point about the time as well, because this is a time investment, and it's just true to say that it's so much faster if you don't have to share your data or tidy it up or share your code or anything. You just write the paper and publish the paper. It's faster. So you are incurring a time cost, especially if you need to, you know, you're still kind of learning the code side of things as well, or the data or whatever. You need to take time and pretty these up and make sure it's useful and correct. And it's easier to just whack together a paper and publish it where you don't need to share anything, and it's done. So it's a non-zero time cost. And so we would hope that there are benefits there that accrue to outweigh that. And I would suggest that there definitely are, even just in terms of it's way more useful science that you're producing. If we can then all poke through each other and build on that, I'd much rather build on something where I can see the thinking out loud and grab the data. Certainly when you're running these big, you know, things like meta-analyses and whatnot as well, it's like, it's such a nightmare when it's like you report one p-value and then, okay, so I'll email the 20 authors and they'll just ignore me for 3 months, and then forget it, your paper just gets excluded anyway, and then science suffers as a result. But you know, it would have been much faster to just chuck a paper out there like that. But yeah, it's a really good point. It takes time, and with all these things, we just need to, I think, calibrate. So like a lot of what we'll talk about today and in the next few weeks might just be aspirational in some ways. Like, yes, we'll go through what would really nice tidy code be and what a really nice tidy data set might look like. And if you can just, you know, each time we do it and write the next paper, we just go a little bit further and learn one new thing and try one new thing, then that's brilliant. Before you know it, you'll be miles away from where you were when you first began. But we just, yeah, we need to do what works for us and what we're capable of at a given time, for sure. Yeah, well, those are fantastic points. And you're exactly right. But the world's moving this way, so let's get ahead of the train anyway. So let's start thinking about what makes a tidy project, tidy digital project. And some of this stuff might be kind of basic. Maybe you already know this, maybe not. I teach this to honors students and grad students, and a lot of the time it isn't. So it's there hopefully will be bits and pieces as we go that are new and useful to you, some little tips and tricks that we might go through. So we start thinking about how we organize our digital lives. Well, we can first talk about what a project is. So in this context, I'm thinking about any sort of discrete little unit of work that we might be interested in maintaining into the future and perhaps sharing with ourselves or with others. So like a paper is an obvious discrete little project, a given publication or a chapter in a thesis, or a unit of study that you're taking or that you're coordinating and presenting. Those might be nice discrete little projects. It kind of varies and you can draw the lines where you like, but it's, yeah, anything sort of self-contained that might be useful into the future. And so then we go on to think about what it is that makes a given digital project tidy. Sometimes it's easiest to start with what isn't a tidy project and what we might be looking to avoid. So if we're imagining a paper that we're writing, something like this would be a real example of a pretty darn messy, but this is actually a screenshot from me some years ago. So this is not pointing fingers at anyone. So here is, say, a project from back when I was doing honors, I think it was, or I've got some code and we've got some data files mashed in there. I'm like all on this one sort of level. Got a bunch of files, got some images, got some figures, and it's all just kind of mashed in there in this one nightmarish sort of little digital hellscape that's just everything thinking out loud, all in one place sitting on my computer there. Various issues with this. It's really hard to find anything that I might need. So I don't, just looking at that, going back to it a week later or years later, as you often do, because you're like, did that cool thing once, and then I go back into my archives and it's like, whoa, what was I thinking? I can't find it. Couldn't even find like the canonical data set, the main data set versus like the manuscript file that I ultimately produced versus some figures. I wouldn't even know where to begin starting to look for that, nor would anyone else if I was to share something like this. I don't know what's canonical in the sense that I don't know what the important stuff is. Like, what's the real raw data, and what are all those little data sets that you kind of generate as you go along? What are the figures that can just be regenerated and thrown out? What's important and what's not? Which documents? What's the final version of like the document that I produced, and what are all the increments along the way that I actually don't care about? Same with importance. It's tied up right in there. There's definitely going to be mistakes in there. And if I find a mistake in my own work, it's going to be hard to even know where to begin to look. So much copying and pasting going on here, duplication of data sets and efforts that I just can't trace the workflow. So I don't know how I got this data set, subset data set from this big data set, and what the difference between the two are. There's going to be mistakes in here, and they'll be hard to trace and fix. Certainly wouldn't dare share this kind of thing with anyone, because if I can't understand my own work, no one else certainly is going to be able to navigate this mess and then build on it and make use of it. And yeah, look, it's just hard. It's just hard work. So that's kind of what we're talking about, a messy digital project, a messy project. It's what we might like to avoid. And so there are some pretty simple ways we can start to do that if we start to think about how we arrange our digital lives in a slightly different way. Here's a lovely example of like a nice tidy little digital project sitting on my computer, for example. I have like a folder that's labeled sensibly, might be manuscript, might be, project lizard color or whatever. And within that, I've got this is like a template that I use. People have their different little templates, but this is a little template that I use. So all of my papers share this basic structure. And so I always know where to go. And even if I didn't know where to go, I can kind of guess where to go. So if I want to find the raw data, probably pop into this little data folder here. If I wanted to find the documents, it would most likely be contained in doc here. If I wanted to find figures, literature relating to the thing that I'm writing, outputs, or the R code that I use to run all my analyses and generate all those little figures and whatnot, I can pretty well just guess based on this directory structure where I should go to find interesting things. And if I shared it with someone, which I do, they can pretty well guess as well. If they didn't want to guess, I've also got this thing called a Readme file here. So that sits nice and high up at the top level here. So someone can open that and I'll tell you what that contains in a tick. But really it's just a text file, and it describes exactly what someone should expect to find in all of these things. Raw data are contained within blah, documents are contained within blah. So someone, it's like a little navigation file. Someone can always double click on that, including me going back to a project from years ago. And it'll tell me exactly what I should expect to find in all of these different things.
Tom, can I ask, your R and your output folders differ because your R is your CSV files and your output's your code, or?
Other way around. So actually for me, it's, whoops, if I jump to my example here, for me, the R contains just the code itself.
Okay.
Data, so output would be, output is anything that I don't care if it completely gets thrown out. So it might be like little tables that you generate, or little, there's just always bits and pieces that you might temporarily save and chuck in there. So it's just miscellaneous sort of output for me, little tables or subset bits of data. But I wouldn't be scared if that whole output folder was just deleted, because it's just temporary. It was just stuff that can be regenerated from code. Yeah, so for me, R is just full of the R code itself that does all the hard work. CSV files will always be, so data itself will be in my data folder. And I also have a further subdivision in my data folder. So I'll have raw data and I'll have derived data, because I'm often, you often have a big, crazy raw data file, and then you actually split it up for whatever reason into derived data sets. And so I'll keep those separate. And then the document, is just like the manuscript. Figures, again, figures, I do my very best to, they're always programmatically generated. So in principle, figs as well, you could just delete everything in there. And if you rerun the code, it'll just spit out and fill that folder back up again with all the figures. For my manuscript, unless it's very occasionally, you need to do a bit of photoshopping and stick a thing in there because it's too hard with R. But yeah, by and large, that's just all the stuff that you can trace directly to what's included in the paper. And you can see, I think, like here's my example. I don't think I have the doc here because I typically don't bother when, this is how it sits on my computer. And then when I bundle it up to share it for publication, I typically don't have the doc in there because that's just the manuscript itself, and people don't need to see all the rough drafts and whatnot. But yeah, all these other things typically live here. So there's like a Readme file, and that's just what you're looking at. It's just a very, very quick and simple high-level overview of where people should go to find stuff. There's my figs, and so these were the handful of figures that ended up in the paper, and you can just regenerate them from code. Oh, it's a bit huge, but some figure that ended up in the paper. Data, it was very simple. It was only one data set with some metadata. We'll talk about what that is in a tick, and a little phylogenetic tree. So those are the bits of data, and just the one R. It was a pretty simple analysis. So just the one R script for me. So that's how it looks on my computer as well. They all share that kind of a structure. Like when I'm working on data, I actually have just a template that sits there. So when I'm starting a new project, just copy paste that template, and it's full of stuff. So it's always got my data, documents folder, figures, some literature, any output, and my bit of R code there. And it's all just ready to go. So just same thing every time, nice and tidy. And then when I dive back into my archive full of crazy old projects, and as long as it was within the last few years, I can expect to find that kind of a structure. And so I'll know where to go and what to do. But then you go deep into like your honors and years and whatnot, it just goes crazy. But so that's what, I don't think I skipped over anything too important. What all I'm aiming for here, and what you might be aiming for, is that guiding principles is that your little directory structure should be nice and self-contained. So you think about what constitutes a project for you. A thesis chapter, one paper with its related data set and whatnot. Think about, a directory sort of structure that works for you and that makes sense to you. yours might be a bit different, especially if you do different kinds of, in different fields, different kinds of work. You may have a couple of sensible folders within these because again, you're generating heaps of phylogenetic trees. So you might want to separate those kinds of data from, CSV files of field data or whatever. And there's always a bit of a README here. So just some high level text document, very simple, but that just describes what you might expect to find within each of these folders within your broader structure. And so if you do this right from day one, you're starting a new project, copy of your little template and get synced right into it. It's hard to get lost when you come back to it in a week, in a year, and you can just dump that whole thing in someone's lap. Or as you'll often find, you get students' data. So I teach my students this, and students move on and whatnot, but then they can just dump the whole thing with me and I can kind of make sense of it. And that's great. Or I can give it to collaborators and it's just much easier to navigate and get through. That's what it kind of looks like. So that's just for me though, but it could be a sensible place to start. Oh, okay, yeah, right. It could be a sensible place to start. I think with those exercises, you can think about this and we can, we can chip away at in your own time, really. I typically just have people think about and maybe piece together a little template that might suit them. And it might be different for different things as well. So for my research project, it's one. For the units of study that I coordinate, I've got a slightly different template, right? For the units of study that I've taken in the past or workshops that I attend, I have a separate little structure. So I've got a few that I just keep recycling and reusing that are nice and generic and flexible so that I'm always, it's much easier to keep track of well into the future, which is really the foundations of our little tidy project. Anyway, so instead of going through, are there any questions at this stage? I don't know if that seems too simple, and that's something you already do anyway, or if it's kind of handy. But if is there anything that leaps out at you, or you'd like to think a bit more about at this point?
I think it's really useful, Tom, to reflect on the benefits of investing in a rigorous structure from the beginning. And it's something I've evolved more into myself, but I don't have something that looks as nice and clean as that. And I wish I'd done it years ago, but of course, I always used analyzing data different ways when I started my career. I think that's great advice. I want to know if your sock drawer has got more tidy over the years.
So if it's translated, arguably my digital life is tidier and has evolved much further than my actual life. But if I had to pick one,
can't win
can't have it all. But no, that's a great point. And I agree. And gosh, I wish I did it earlier, but I think that's just completely inevitable. No time like the present though. And we start now with these things and making some good habits. You'll come back to the work that you do in a year, in 2 years, whatever. And it's just, you're like, it's a breath of fresh air because you can just jump right back in, grab that data set that you actually wanted, and off you go. You dive back into my other stuff and it's just, but yeah, we're all gonna learn. But yeah, well, great. So it's just, that's one way of doing it. You can poke around on my data sets if you want inspiration on, where to maybe start. But if everyone's needs might be slightly different, but just taking those principles and acting on them, it's a huge, it really makes a difference. Okay, well, we can take a moment, if anything comes out, by all means, steal it, Kelly, thanks. That's what it's there for. If we move on then to think about applying some of these similar principles to data itself, things get a little bit more involved here, but it's really fundamentally the goals are the same. So here we're creating projects and structuring our projects so that they're maximally useful, reproducible for ourselves, for other people. Applying it to data is its own thing, and there are complexities because data can take many shapes and forms, but the principles are kind of similar, where the goal here is to create work that lives well into the future, that can be interpreted by ourselves and by others, and that isn't kind of an ad hoc collation of sheets and whatnot that we need to navigate. Need a map to navigate every time diving back into it. But so really, I try and introduce a handful of rules, little guidelines for creating tidy data that help us keep things neat and tidy, but keeping in mind that they may vary slightly depending on what your data is, but these haven't gone astray in thinking about some of these things, and we'll step through them one at a time. And there are a few more in that little document that I shared, but we'll wander through some good rules to keep in mind when, if it's step one, just when creating a new data set. That's a great time to start, or if we're going back to ourselves to some existing data, and we can have a crack at actually fixing up. I've given you an example data set there. We can have a bit of a crack at fixing up that data because we would often work with other people's data. But our golden rules, so things like every variable forms a column in a tidy data set, and every observation forms a row. I'll show you exactly what that means in a moment. We should and ideally would only use plain text files. So no crazy complex proprietary formats like Excel and whatnot, which change over time and you need expensive software to access them. And you may run into configurable, compatibility issues and whatnot. We need to name things sensibly, variables, observations, data files themselves. We need to be able to choose good names that other humans and computers can work with very well. We don't want to leave blanks and uninterpretable data in there. We'll go through what that means. We want some metadata wherever possible. So we want data which describes data in the same way that we've got like a Readme file that helps people navigate our little project directory. We want a data set that actually describes what's in our data. So what do those variable names actually mean? Those 60 variables that you've got, what on earth do each of them mean? What kinds of data should we expect to find in each of those columns? We don't touch raw data. So once everything's in, leave it alone. And the only way we ideally would manipulate data is through code. Again, some of these goals we just recognize that they're aspirational. And so it's going to take you a month to learn how to do some of these things. And we can cheat on some of these rules, as we'll see, and just work towards these ultimate goals. When creating and maintaining tidy data, we just want to be consistent throughout. Again, like a little project directory, just so it's always the same. We always know what we're going back to and what things mean. And dates are just uniquely awful. So we'll just touch on a couple of things that might be useful for handling them. And there are a few more, but those are, if you can sort of we can internalize just some of these tips, going a long way to making your own life and other people's lives easier, your future self, your collaborators, because your data sets will just be that much more ready to use and ready to manipulate going forward. So we'll step through, we'll have a little wander through each of those. First rule, when you're creating a nice data set, a tidy data set would be characterized by having variables in columns and observations in each row. So these are variables: country, year, cases, population, nice and tidy. And there's one observation per row. This makes it easier to navigate if you're actually just flicking through and digging through, but often a lot of these goals are explicitly designed as well to make it easier to manipulate with code. And so some of these things that we'll go through means that computers will have an easier time handling this information, and ourselves using R, trying to interact with data, be much easier for us to manipulate, wrangle, plot, model, statistically model, if our data are arranged in this kind of a format. So we can go through a couple of examples of what's right and what's wrong. So we'll give you a second to think about maybe which of our rules these sort of violate. So if we imagine we want every variable to be a column, every observation a row. It's a bit of a messy data set here. It's from the Pew Research Center, and it's a pinch straight from Hadley Wickham's paper on tidy data, which is referenced in the little handbook handout. It's something like annual earnings, the correspondence between religious affiliation and annual earnings. So you can see some kind of survey data, how many people fall into each of these categories. But look, the main thing I think here is that we do have sort of, we've got a nice variable in a column here, which is what you'd expect. But we also have a variable which we're interested in, so earnings, scattered across multiple columns. So it's quite a wide, this is like a wide format data set, and it's messy and wide because some of that interesting information that we're really interested in is actually smeared across multiple columns here. So that's going to make it kind of hard to navigate, but also once we start next week and in the coming weeks getting into manipulating it with code, it's hard to wrangle these kind of data sets because there's good information there, but it's not, it's one variable, so earnings, but it's smeared across multiple columns there. So it makes it hard to get to. So if we were to tidy this up, it might look something like this. So we've got we've got one variable in each column now. We've got one observation in every row. So religious affiliation, income, and the frequency of respondents, in that particular category. So here's our wide format. Again, we've got a variable smeared across multiple columns here. Makes it tricky to get at that information. And so we've arranged it according to our rules. We've got a variable per column, religion, income, frequency, and each row is one single observation. And it's lovely. Then you can just, again, when we get into R, we can just plot frequency as a function of income, or we can run a linear model and just plot and handle these things in a much tidier way. It's also very easy to navigate because everything is nice and orderly there. One more example. This is quite a complex example. So I'll give you a moment to just eyeball it and see what you think might be right or wrong. So just to describe it a little more, it's like temperature weather readings, I think. So these are weather stations. There's a year and month in which it was collected. There's the kind of reading it was. So minimum or maximum temperature. And then there's the actual value that was recorded along particular days of that month. So day 8 of month 1 in year 2010, minimum and maximum temperatures were this or that. And so there's a few things going on here, but really again, it's just an exaggeration of the previous problem in that you've got variables that are stored within columns, across columns, and across rows as well. So there's a lot of information that we're really interested in, but it's smeared across multiple structures. So it's pretty hard to get at. So we've got variables in columns as we might like them to be. Here's the ID of a station, or the year in which that measurement was collected, or the month. So that's all great. But we have variables across columns as well. So the day on which a given recording was collected, that's across columns. We also have the kind of recording that was collected smeared across rows here. So we've got variables across these rows. We've got them across columns and within columns as well. It's kind of violating all our rules at once. Makes it a little hard to keep track of what's going on, and make it very hard to manipulate these data into the future. So if we consider them and consider our rules and spend a little time wrangling this, the final product might look a little something like this. So here we've got one variable per column, ID, date, maximum temperature, minimum temperature. And each row is a single observation. Nice and simple. We could then plot the maximum temperature in March, just as easy as a line of code, or difference between the maximum minimum temperature for the first 6 months. Easy, another little line, because they're all nice and tidy. So we've gone from here, variables in columns and across columns and across rows. And there's going to inevitably be a whole bunch of blank, annoying empty data as well, because some of these days will be impossible. A lot of missing measurements. And so there's just a heck of a lot of a blank space in this kind of a data structure as well. If we tidy it up, we follow a simple rule. Variables go in columns, observations goes in rules. A nice, clean, minimal data set. We know where to look for things. R will be happy with this because it'll just be that much easier to manipulate into the future. So on to our next rule, and jump in anytime if things get confusing or move too quickly, is just use a plain text file. So the main reason for this, and I'll explain what plain text actually means, there are a few different kinds of plain text files that we might use. The big reason is just things like compatibility. So if you're using Excel, if you're using Excel from 1995 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 2000, 2010, your file might take any one of these extensions. It'll have all sorts of weird things going on under the hood. This one may or may not be compatible with that one. And so if you're looking to preserve things off into the future, to share it with other people that might be using different programs, then we kind of want to pick a file format that's just going to be nice and compatible with ourselves in the future, with other people. And text files just don't change. The earliest computers just had instructions on what to do in ones and zeros in text files. They haven't changed since that day. Every computer in the world can read a text file, doesn't need any fancy software. You don't need to pay money to be able to read these things. So you can just be guaranteed, or as best we can, guaranteed that a nice simple text file will be shareable and interpretable by other people. And when I say text file, there are a few different kinds, and you will definitely come across them. As CSV file is a very common one. That is just a kind of a plain text file in which the values are comma separated, CSV. Or you've got a thing like an actual text file, which is TXT, or a thing like a tab separated value, which is where all your numbers and your columns and whatnot are separated by a tab, which is a special character on a computer. So you don't need to worry too much about it, but really, if you pick one of these and stick to it, I would suggest that CSVs are very, very common, widely used. Excel can spit them out. You just need to make sure that you're saving things as a CSV file. And then you're kind of going quite a long way to ensuring that your work is just safe and future-proof. It's a very simple file type. You also don't have to worry about all that craziness that Excel does with formatting, because CSV files, there's nothing, the upside is that they're a very simple data structure, but if you use things like formatting, like highlighting cells or bolding and all the kind of fancy stuff that Excel might do, or including formulas or whatnot, those things won't be saved or preserved in CSV files because they're very, very simple. And all of that stuff relies on Excel craziness in the background. I would suggest that in general, that's a very good thing because it just keeps us working bare bones. And any manipulations to the data we need to do, we do it with code. And that kind of enforces that. But that is just something to keep in mind. And Excel will create big, scary warnings like, warning, you can't highlight this cell if you save it as a CSV file, God forbid. And so it'll try and make it all scary. Why don't you use their proprietary file format? Well, because I want this to be useful long into the future. So just say, use plain text wherever possible for creating your data, for storing it, for preserving it off into the future, for the reasons of compatibility and shareability as well. When it comes to data files, to variable names, to anything we do working with digital information, we want to choose some good names for things. And we want it to be, I'll give you a couple of, again, rules we might follow. Here's a couple of good ideas, a couple of bad ideas. My abstract .docx, no idea what that is. Abstract for what? Who knows? Tom's best ideas, what's going on here? You've got some weird characters, you've got spaces, you've got commas, you've got all sorts of things that computers ultimately don't like very much. Modern computers kind of handle them okay, because you can name something with spaces and commas. If I tried to access that programmatically though, it's not going to work terribly well because computers at that more base level freak out when you use things like spaces and special characters. Figure 1, no idea what's inside that. Couldn't even guess, maybe based on the folder structure or something, but ultimately got no idea. And here, we've all done this kind of hackneyed version control sort of thing where we just keep duplicating stuff. And it's like, I swear for the real, this is the final version of this file, and this is the one you really want. Generally not a great way to do things because you inevitably create another one and you have no idea what the actual canonical version is. So it's some nicer, tidier versions here. I know what's inside this file. doesn't use any special characters, so I can access it in various ways, kind of know what that figure is probably going to show me, because if I'm working in R and I don't want to have to click through and actually open up the file to figure it out, I'm pretty sure that's the one I want. And you know, here's a date stamped. It's something as simple as adding a date, because then I can tell if this was actually the final one or one of the 10 versions back, and the date will tell me that. So some rules for what makes a good name would be something that our computer likes and that we like. So computers need to be able to read it and handle it and interact with it, and we need to be able to do the same, of course. And related to that latter point is that it might be nicely arranged and organized on our computer. So to get there, things that the machines and computers don't like are special characters. So any of this kind of stuff, they really don't like anything except just text. The exception being underscores and dashes, which I'll show you, but really all these exclamation points and these weird characters that are often language specific, and computers by and large don't like them. You can use them and get away with them in some contexts, but just avoid them completely. Just don't even use them. This is true for files, for variables, for any of that stuff. So anything we're naming on our computer, just forget about using special characters. Instead, if you need to split up words or split up dates or whatever, just use these two. Underscores work everywhere and dashes work most places. Underscores are pretty much ubiquitous and they work everywhere. So you can use those. And this is true for variable names, for file names, what have you. To make our life easier, let's try and think of variables and files that are a bit richer in information, because it's always easy to remove information from variable names and keep things simpler if we need to, but trying to infer what's inside something from these pretty generic names. I have a terrible habit of naming. In an R script, you know, I'll load my data file, and it'll be called data, and there'll be a variable called data. And then later on, I just forget what that possibly contains when I've got 10 other subset data sets. And I'm like, no, I'm still in that habit. But so we might try and go a little further and create file names and whatnot that are a bit richer, and they just help us along our way so that other people and us in 6 months can kind of get a bit of a sense of what's in there without having to dig through all the metadata and the readmes and whatnot. Here's a very simple one. I've got a date. It's in the standard date format is year, month, day. So year, month, day, and then I know this is cool because I've got this bit of field data, and right, because I've got a bunch of different data on that field trip. These are just the heights and the weights. Cool. I can pretty well guess what's in that. It's a nice plain text file. Simple. My computer's going to be able to handle that. Other people could guess what's in that. Great. And when I'm talking about this ordering as well, your computer will you can always sort things manually and choose different ways of doing it, but computers naturally, you know, sort chronologically or alphabetically. And you can kind of just take advantage of that when arranging your digital life. So you could pop dates in front of things, and that way they'll always be ordered in date order. So yeah, here's the most recent. I went out 6 times into the field and collected heights and weights, created 6 different raw data sets. Well, that was field trip 1, 2, 3, and they'll just sit there on your computer in chronological order, because that's how computers like to arrange things. So we can make use of that. Or we can do it logically, and we can manipulate that a little bit. So I'll often have a few different R scripts for a given analysis, because, you know, you can start to get a bit unwieldy, 1,000 lines of code that's doing all sorts of different things. So I might split it up into a few different parts. I might have the first R script that just loads a bunch of functions and whatnot that I use. The second one does all the cleaning and the wrangling and the manipulating of the data. The third one's where I analyze things, run my models, and create my plots. But if I just called it, you know, if we blanked it out, it would try and sort these alphabetically. So this would go before this, but just by making use of the fact that they sort things, that 0, 1 comes before 0, 2 in the alphabet, it's alphanumeric. I know that those will always sit there in a nice logical order on my computer, so that I just hit the first one because I know that's the one I want first off. Again, it just makes things a little bit faster, a little bit easier for us and other people. So those are our general naming conventions, and we'll carry this through a little bit as well. The same is true in the data itself. And so I've said here, no empty cells or special characters. In your data sets themselves, you know, there's often missing data. There's often mysterious equipment failures or failures of weather or whatever. But we just want to be nice and consistent when we're representing those missing values. So never leave a cell empty, because empty is ambiguous. It's hard to interpret by humans. Computers don't like it. R doesn't really like it. It'll try to fill it with something. And it may not always be exactly what you want. And don't use special characters, again, just in any context, in names, but certainly not to represent things like missing values. So question marks aren't going to be very good candidates there. The standard for representing missing data is NA, not applicable. It's just a big capital NA, or lowercase, but uppercase is what R likes. So if there's ever any sort of bit of missing information, there should never be blank cells in our data sets. It's just an NA. If the data is actually 0, then that should of course be 0 because that's a real value. But if it's just missing data for whatever reason, we pop it in there as NA. If you need to add like context for that, maybe there are different kinds of missing data. One is for when the bit of the gadget broke, and the other one's because the weather was bad, and the other one's because we slept in a bit or something. And we need to differentiate those, and you're like, well, I use a question mark for one of them and an exclamation point for another one. What we just do instead is use NA for all of those, and you could plonk in like a notes column, like a little extra variable that just gives you a chance to then explain and offer a bit of extra context. It would be that simple. So milk volume here, if I want to differentiate this NA from some other NA down there, might have a notes column, and in notes, I would just have, that would be blank. Oh, that would be NA, sorry, that would be NA. And here I'd say machine failed. Cool. Just a bit of context for me for later on. Down here, I might say, or weather was bad, so I didn't go out, that kind of thing. But NA is good. And then R, or whatever coding programming language you use, will know for absolute certainty that that's a missing value. We want some metadata, ideally. Again, all these things take a little bit of time, but at its very simplest, metadata or a data dictionary is another file that you keep alongside your data file that just describes what's in that data file. So at its very simplest, here's some ecological data set. You know, we've got some variables in columns here, observations in our rows. But if I come back to that in a year's time, or I share it with someone else, they may not know what, I mean, author and year are pretty straightforward, but things like obs, study, group, what do those actually mean? Not to mention all the crazy variables that we often have and come up with during our data sets. So for that, I would just look in my metadata. I'd say, okay, so here I've got the variables themselves. I've got a simple description of what kind of data I might expect to find in each of those columns. Is it numeric data? So should I just be expecting to find numbers? The character data, should I be expecting words? Are they integers versus doubles or floats? You know, simple versus complex numbers. You can go right through. But even just very, very simply, should I be expecting numbers or words? Great. And then just a textual description of what that actual thing is. So authors, well, that's kind of straightforward. Year is publication year. Obs, okay, so that's an observation level ID. So that should be a unique ID for every single observation. Got it? Study, all right, so that's a study level ID. So every study should have a unique ID. Right, that makes sense, that's right, that's what I was doing. And so on and so on. Someone else could read this, I could read this. I then know what all my variable means. Variables mean, and there's also some quality control in there as well. Because if I start hitting, if I'm expecting a numeric values in my year, and then I load it into R and it says, wait, there's characters in here. I know something's a bit weird, or something maybe isn't as it should be. So there's some built-in quality control there as well. And it just forces us to reflect on exactly what we're doing as well. And I find it useful in that sense. So that's all metadata. In the same way, we've got a README for our project structure. We might have metadata, which describes our data. Oh, there we go. Data about data. That's all we just went through. Richer and detailed, but even just, again, aspirationally, richer and detailed. At its very simplest, if you've just got a simple file like this that just has the variables, what the heck that variable means, you're going a long way even there, because you'll still be able to come back and kind of figure it out. That's a real leap forward, because all those crazy derived, Shannon's diversity, if you just have diversity in a column, who knows what kind of measure of, one of the 20 measures of diversity that could possibly be. We've got a bit of metadata saying Shannon diversity derived from data in columns X and Y. Easy, never forget. General rule for our tidiness is that we, and our sanity is that we treat data, encourage us to treat data as read only. So once you've gathered it, maybe it's pen and paper, maybe it's just, maybe it's straight in digital right off the bats. Once it's in there, once it's in that raw data file, we just don't touch it ever again. We never, don't open it, don't need to open it back up. Oh, you can open it and eyeball it, but we just don't manipulate those data in there anymore. Again, aspirationally, in a perfect world, what we would do then is only ever manipulate those data using code. And the reason is that it's got a fully documented and richly, with a completely explicit history of changes to that data set. Then we know exactly where everything came from. We have transformed variables that come from variables in our data set. Even if we're fixing up typos or mistyped, bits of data or whatnot, every change to that data set is then fully documented in the code that we use to generate, the subsequent data set. So just for sanity, for transparency, for reproducibility, and so, look, I do accept, of course, that we may not be there yet in our skills, knowledge, understanding. Sometimes it might just be impractical. In which case, if we do have to do something by hand, I just encourage everyone to only work on a copy. So there is always a canonical, like prime ultimate data set that just stands there in its little glass case. We can create a copy, some derived version of it. And then every change that we make in there, we can just jot it down, like replace this value with that value because it was typed in incorrectly, or derive this variable from that variable by this process. If we could just do it by code, that would be great. But if you're working towards that process, which is totally understandable, then perhaps just keeping track of what we're doing would go a long way as well. And again, that's just for our own sake into the future. We come back, where on earth did that variable come from? Or we find a mistake, this one doesn't make biological sense. What's going on there? Oh, I see what I did. I, didn't square it. I took the root or whatever. So I'll just tweak that bit of code, blam, fixed. And same, when sharing it with other people as well. And the almost 7, I think we had 8 rules. One is just be consistent. It's pretty straightforward, as we did with our little data directory for our insanity. In terms of things like your naming conventions, these are actually real descriptions. These are actually what they're really called, these naming conventions. In the computer world, you've got snake case or camel case, where you mash words together and capitalize the second letter. Kebab case, I like just for the name. Just pick something that seems sane and sensible to you. These are all perfectly justifiable. Just pick something that makes sense to you, that's interpretable, and just use it for all your projects, for all your variable namings, for all your file namings. It's when you start to really mix things up that things go off the rails a bit and be tough to keep track of what's going on. I like snake case because it's nice and human readable and machine readable, but all of these are perfectly fine. The screaming snake is a bit dramatic, but whatever works for you. And the final little tip is just that dates it can be a real pain. And not to mention, Excel really just has such a knack for mangling dates, or just thinking everything is a date. Sometimes it's just 2 numbers, and I just want to pop them in, and it's like, oh, you mean like 1906 is when this was taken or whatever, and it's just crazy. So just stick away from them if at all possible. What I often do is just split them up. So I have a day, month, and a year. That's pretty straightforward. It's always easier to mash things back together. So in R, you might actually need to use dates, which are like a particular data structure at some point, but you can always just glue those things together into a proper date format. You might have time in hours, minutes, seconds as well, if you really need to. I just keep them separate. But if you do need proper dates, just use I just suggest using this international standard, which is year, month, day, not the crazy American month, day, year, or even day, month, year can be tricky. That's kind of the standard. And then you've got hours, minutes, seconds, if you need further information there. But basically, I just keep things separate if possible. It's always easy to glue them together. Glue that together into this format if you need to, which R does sometimes, but it can be hard to split them up. And even programming languages and Excel can do some pretty wild things, trying to guess what possibly is a date and what's a day and what's a month, what's a year, depending on what, whether you've got it set to US versus UK mode and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so look, I mean, this one might actually be worth poking through. There's a little data set in there. I guess, I don't know if we need to, the code one's pretty quick. Where did I put it? So I gave you an awful messy data set. We can just chat and maybe take 5 minutes to have a poke through. Where did I just put it for you? So I've given it to you. And I'll paste that if anyone just popped in more recently. All these materials and the slides are just available at that link. And it's in data, and it's called Messy Survey. And it's just a data set that breaks all our rules. And so we could take 5 minutes to jot down what you think is chaotic about this, what we might change, how we might arrange it. And you can even start to do it a little bit if you like. And then we'll go through. So there's a few tabs. It's got a particular name. Take 5, grab a cup of tea as well. And we can come back and try and figure out what the heck is going on with this data set that violates all our rules. Those tips are also just written in long format here. So they're like our little data tips in that PDF that's in there for you as well. Or any other questions, by all means. I'm going to figure out what's going on with this data set. Yeah, I feel like I need some smooth jazz to play or something while we're all thinking. Elevator music.
I think we're just like processing, like having a look at it.
No, of course. Take your time. And this is truly heinous. This is bad. Although it's not, it's not. I've come across data sets like this, especially, well, from my past self and from students as well. So, yeah, by all means, take some time and we'll chat.
So, what's this variable plot?
Good question. We can only guess because this person decided not to give us any metadata. So I guess that's one of the many problems that we're faced with in the real world. So one of the things we might do is create our own little bit of metadata and kind of try and take a bit of a guess at what's going on here. To my mind, it looks like, so they're field data from at least 2 different years, from multiple plots, whatever that is. So they're replicates, I would guess. There's the sex of some organism and the weight of some organism, and the date on which they were collected. But yeah, that would be one of the many problems that I would suggest is we could start to rectify, we could create our own metadata perhaps, and just take a guess and start, trying to imagine what might be meant by plot. And yeah. Oh, and they're individual species as well. That's right. Yeah. So again, while you're chipping away, I might, when I am faced with some of these data sets, sometimes I just, essentially create a fresh one. It could be a new tab or something, and I try and imagine what it might look like in its tidy form, and I start to kind of work backwards from there. So I might do. And eventually I'll split this off and save it as its own thing. But so I'll jot things down like, what do I think is a variable here? What do I think is an observation? And so I try and just picture what the final tidy product might look like, and then work backwards a little bit. Figure out what the heck they were doing. I haven't looked at this in a year, so that's actually a fair question. I'll just start working on my own, but by all means, keep chipping away and we'll reconvene in a few.
Sorry to have to play catch up, Tom. I had to step out. I'm hosting a sleepover for Halloween girls who are off school, and I've just managed to dispatch them all. Are we on a break, or I just missed the last few minutes?
Oh, sorry, no, we were just chatting. We've got not at all, perfectly good reason. We're just working through. I've given you a little example data set.
Oh yeah, okay.
Download. We're just working. It's a chaotic, messy data set. It breaks all our rules, and so we're just chipping away, having a bit of a think about what we might do to tidy that up or how we might get there. I'm just doing that myself. Everyone's just sort of poking away, and then we're just going to have a chat in a few minutes and see what kind of sanity we can make from this mess. Yeah, that's it. So that's all I'm looking at on my screen. It's the same data set that you've got.
Okay, thanks.
And this is one of those examples where it's so chaotic that it would be really hard to actually manipulate this programmatically into a sensible data set. So this is one of those examples where I might just actually do it by hand and just keep track of what I'm doing. If someone emailed me this, whatever, and I had to turn it into something sane, it would be so fiddly to try and get this into, to use R to do the whole thing. I'd just probably do it by hand, but keep close track. And I would keep this master copy and, just have a hacked version that I cobbled together, and kept keeping notes at each stage of moved this to here, did this to this, all that kind of stuff. So date, what if it's change.
Oh, can I ask a question? But it's
Please.
about a previous topic.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about your scripts that there are sometimes it's easier to just divide it into three. Like some of them to just tidy up and another one to actually do the analysis. And it's actually a two-part question. So the first one is the loading. That one, what is it for, really? And then the second part is, would you share the whole as all the three scripts or just the last one?
Yeah, great question. So something like loading might be if you've got a bunch of libraries, and sometimes you have custom written functions that do a bunch of stuff as well. So I tend to keep them in their own little script, otherwise they can take up quite a lot of room at the top of a file. So yeah, that might just be the general craft. So loading up your libraries, defining various functions that you might custom write because you need them to do certain things. So I just could put that all in one. And then which we can go through in coming weeks as well. You can daisy chain them together. I'm not sure if you're familiar, if you've used this. There's a so if you've got, say, 3 different scripts, you can actually, rather than having to, run one, then run the other, then run the other, you can daisy chain them together so that the third script will run the second one, which will run the first one. So you might have something like a loading function, a tidying function, then your analysis. But if you just run the analysis function, it automatically runs this, which runs this. And so you can link up your script to do that all in one tidy go through using things like this source function, which is a little function that helps you. You can type in if there's another script, if I had another script and it was called some script, then from within this little script here, I could use this source function to actually just run the other script in its entirety. And so by using something like that, you can link multiple different files together. And so, yeah, in my ultimate analysis file, I can just run that, because if I've got this up top, it'll run that, it'll also run that, it'll also run that. But it's by splitting them up in that way, I just find them more human readable. So I know that all my cleaning stuff goes in here, all my analysis goes in here and whatnot. And yeah, I guess generally I'd suggest you do them all, because you'd share them all if they were, again, it takes time and effort to structure them like this, but yeah, in a perfect world, I'd share the whole thing, because to get to that analysis, you kind of need everything that came before it. And in a cleaning file or whatever, you've got all the bits if they were like missing data and you needed to remove those, or you needed to fix these wonky values. What happens in the analysis file it's not going to be perfectly reproducible or transparent, I guess, if you don't also include those previous steps. So yes, perfect world, I'd just share them all. And yeah, I sort of daisy chain them together like that, just to keep it a bit simple, because those sort of 1,000 lines, once you start getting up there and those big megabits of code, life can get a bit messy, for sure.
Great tip, thanks.
No, at all. I'm just trying to make sense of this absolute nonsense. So I could probably read, yeah. Oops. So like this would take much longer than we have, but we can at least start to try and make some sense of it. No, wait, one more. Okay. Do this one, and then we'll start to maybe share some tips. Okay, well, we can, I'm just conscious, but this is chaos and would take us some time to get to a proper solution, but thinking out loud, curious to hear some of the more egregious things that people have found. Pretty terrible. So I could start with, here's my, I guess, current version, which may well change, but like, here's my little, if I was to dream up the tidy version of this, just quickly eyeballing and trying to guess at what this person was actually doing, or myself, you know, some months ago. Oh, there's already a mistake there. So that's 40, 48. It might look something like this, 46, 36. We run 37. So all I've done here, I'm just starting with this first little one even. So this is from a 2013 season. We've got different species here in these 3 different weird boxes. So there are a bunch of variables. If I'm just trying to think about my ultimate data set, I want variables in columns, I want observations in rows. Let's just start jotting down all the variables that are obviously contained within this data set. You've got things like the year, so 2013, and here are some dates. So we do have dates. We've got year, month, day. Guessing at what format they use. It's not, you know, it's not abundantly clear, but it looks like day, month, year. I guess it would have to be because there's a 14 here. So yeah, probably it's day, month, year. These are all 2013, so that makes sense. So there's 3 variables right there, year, month, day, or day, month, year. What else have we got? 3 different species. That's a variable that we're interested in. So I've created a species variable here. And then we have what they've also identified as some variables, so plot, sex, and weight, which is the thing they seem to have been measuring. So I've got plot, sex, and weight. Whoops, another mistake. But there are some other things as well. So for example, they've mixed data types here. So they've included a unit of measurement in this one, but not here and not here. So what we only want one type of data for every, in each of our variables. A weight should definitely be a numeric type of data. So we want to get rid of these G's, we want to get rid of any of these words shouldn't be in there. So I've created like a new little one. I've got our weights, which are the numeric values. And I've also got a units variable. So these are all, as far as I can tell, these are all in grams. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that the rest of these are in grams, although I'm not super confident because these are much higher, but given what we've got, it's the best we can do. So I'm going with that. So I've got like a units column here. But then I see that they've also made some notes here and they've mashed them in with this data type about these are an unscaled variable, these 2. So there's something calibration-y that's gone wrong here. That's information I want to keep, but not in that column. So I've also got this calibrated column here. And so I might record, so if they're saying, well, these are not calibrated, I'm going to assume the rest of them are calibrated. That's an assumption. I would jot it down, of course, but I want that information preserved separately. And so I haven't gotten to copying those over, but I've got a calibrated column here as well. So I'm assuming all of these ones are calibrated. And then when I get down to copying these values over, I reckon those 2 probably aren't calibrated because they've said as much. But that's information I want. Again, that's information for its own variable. So I would store that in its own variable. And we could continue going. And so for now, at least, just based on this sheet, I reckon I could keep, yeah, I've got all of that information, but in an infinitely more tidy, useful format. And it's also just more interpretable. So someone could read this even without metadata or whatever and get a bit of a glance and go, yeah, okay, I kind of get what that means. You might ask what calibrated means, but this is just that much cleaner, more useful than something like this. If you go through the rest as well, it's pretty chaotic. So here again, there's uncalibrated stuff, but here they've used formatting to indicate that rather than words, but we would unify that. So it's just, again, slots into a nice little variable here. So these gray cells are uncalibrated. Assume the rest of them are calibrated. Here, they've chaotically arranged things by plot rather than by species. So that makes it difficult, not unified. We can unify it there. Weight, they've used different variable names. They've combined variables here, so species and sex. we would have to split those up into our nice tidy variables, all this kind of stuff. And this is fairly part and parcel, but again, that looks like I could dream up how we could get there to here. We could do that. And for the third one, they seem to have just chaotically, they've gone out for another year, maybe, and they've got one plot only. But again, I think we could get that into our format and just take a couple of guesses as what's going on. But ultimately, from these three chaotic, messy spreadsheets to something like this would just be a world of difference. It would last, it would persist. We would be able to use it into the future. We had a bit of metadata, and R could just use it. You could just chuck it right in there. We could model this as a function of that and plot this as a function of that. Whereas this is just, there's no hope unless we're clicking around in Excel and making some plots or whatever. But that's a long road. And if we just start here with our own stuff, then, well, I mean, life is that much easier. But it's also good to have some of these skills because you inevitably work with other people's data, and it's always just a roller coaster ride when you get emailed these spreadsheets or whatever, and to figure out what the heck is going on. Yeah, so I think that's a good effort. If yours is looking anything vaguely in that world, I think you've done extremely well. There are different opinionated ways you could do different things, but something around that would be close to, I think, close to the best we could do with a chaotic data set like this.
Tom, is it a good lesson to learn to consider for setting up with gathering data that you want to think about how you're going to enter it before you even start to gather it, if you're gathering it yourself?
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you have a template, I mean, I often set up templates for data gathering, but sometimes afterwards I think, oh, why did I put that column in there? Actually, I should have had it a different way.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. Yeah, thanks. No, I agree completely. It can even help with, yeah, I increasingly think that way. Creating the sort of, yeah, the exact data template that you would have. You can even go so far as to sometimes I even think in terms of the code that I would use to run particular analyses, because that can help me think of experimental designs as well. And ultimately, so wait, what's my response here? And you know, how am I crossing this with that? All right, so how do the data need to be structured? So what is it exactly I'm measuring? Like, what's the thing? Like absolutely, I think being explicit about these things ahead of time can have both, yeah, can have benefits, very practical benefits, just in terms of thinking clearly about the problem and exactly what it is you want to know, and how you're going to handle it later. At a real extreme of that now, there's some interesting, and this is like I guess, yeah, quite an extreme in terms of this push for reproducibility. You can now, if you've heard of things called like pre-registered reports, in some fields of medicine and whatnot, you can do things like, or they strongly encourage you to fully pre-register your study. So you basically write the methods for your study. You can even go so far as to write the code for your analyses and use simulated data to feed into that report. And you submit that for peer review in a stage run report. And they say, well, okay, there's your, based on that background, on those methods, on those simulated data, and those, yep, that all looks good, so we accept. And then you go out and actually conduct the experiment and just slot in the real data. And that way, it's essentially quite an extreme attempt to minimize researcher degrees of freedom, publication bias, all that kind of stuff. It would take an enormous amount of effort. I've never done it, and I'm not in a hurry to. But it's a really interesting example of that, where you could essentially, and people do, you know, for medical trials and whatnot, basically create the whole trial, including fake data that they then feed into their, you know, so that they can build their analyses. And then they just go out and do the study and slot it in.
Please tell me that's not how animal ethics committees are going to start.
I know the paperwork's enough of this. That's the main reason I just work with invertebrates. Just I cannot be bothered with that paperwork. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, it is, in pre-registered reports are a real thing in areas of medicine and whatnot now. And there are pushes for them, you know, in ecology and evolution. But I think there are limits to all of this stuff. So I'm not so aboard that train. But it's interesting, and an extreme version of what you're talking about for sure. Getting things ready ahead of time to guide your thinking and data gathering. And the last little bit's pretty quick. So it's just applying some of these rules to our code, and we'll do this in practice over the next few weeks as well. So we don't need to spend a ton of time on it here, but we can just think about what tidy and useful code might look like, and getting to some of those points that were raised. And Laura mentioned, you know, how we can keep things. Some of these things we can be embarrassed about when looking back on our own code or whatnot. But in terms of just something that might be roughly useful to ourselves, to other people, again, just keeping consistent and choosing good names when we're writing our code, good variable names that make sense all the way through. Code is run by computers, but it's read by human beings. So that's well worth keeping in mind. And so we do want to follow just some basic rules of like grammar and visual spacing and tidiness and whatnot, because people are ultimately who need to read and interpret this stuff, while computers just run it and they don't care what your punctuation looks like as long as the syntax is right. Keep it self-contained. There are a few tricks, and we'll reinforce these in practical terms as we go, and keep it nice and readable as we go. So names, just taking those lessons we've already learned and applying them to things like our data. I have a terrible habit of doing exactly this all the time. I've got like my DAT file or whatever. DAT, then when we get down and we're trying to read and figure out what's being manipulated here, what's going on, I don't know really what's in DAT. I'd have to open that up and inspect it to figure out what that object contains, what that variable contains. Whereas if it was something like DAT heights from 2020, I go, oh, okay, those are those height measurements I took in 2020. And this is the raw data. Got it, makes sense. There's, you know, subjectivity and preference and all that sort of stuff in here, but pretty straightforward to see how something like this is a little bit more informative and useful than something like this. There's a balance, of course. You don't want really, really long variable names because you have to type this stuff in all the time, and that might impede upon readability later on, but that's a pretty simple example of how, you know, good versus bad, and we might think along these ways, rather than DAT, DAT2, DAT3, DAT4, who knows what's going on in there. Yeah, in terms of just writing code for people, use comments just, you know, really liberally. So break up your code into big, you know, use some fancy bit of formatting like this or whatever, just to really break it up. This is the bit of the script that loads my data. This loads my libraries. This is where I create plots. This runs my stats, so that anyone, including you, just flicking through, go, oh yeah, this is the manipulation bit. This is the plotting bit. So you can use big headings like that for larger chunks, or, you know, sort of medium-sized chunks. You might have a nice descriptive, that's not terribly descriptive, but it's descriptive enough of what this next immediate bit of code does. Ideally, pretty much every discrete little chunk of code should have a comment kind of telling you what it is, assuming that code is self-documenting, because it's like, well, anyone could look at that and see that what I'm doing is summarizing this and getting the standard deviation. And it's an easy trap to fall into, because that's not going to be obvious to everyone. And it's also useful just as forced reflection as well as to what you're attempting to do here, because maybe you don't always achieve it, or there's a mistake or something creeps in. And you go, well, actually, wait a minute, why have we got the standard error here when clearly I intended to do the standard deviation, something like that. So that's what, comment every little bit, ideally, or you can just put little smaller comments, but only, you know, a couple of words or single line there at the end or right next to is also a standard. So longer comments for longer chunks up the top, big headings and breaks, really break up your code, that's fine, because people need to read this stuff as they go. Continuing that theme, you know, the rules of punctuation kind of they apply. Like, that's, a human will find this hard to read because there are no spaces. We expect spaces after commas and between, you know, enter marks and between within our arithmetic there. So just do that. Just do that in your code as well, because this is much more readable and better spaced than this. They mean the exact same thing to the computer, so he doesn't care. And there are very few circumstances in which it would care. But for people, this is just that much easier to read, because that's how we read words and books and pages and everything. So by all means, keep it nice and cleanly spaced. And there are packages that actually can help us do that. And you can click a button and it'll go through and do it. But we just get in the habit of doing it by ourselves, and it becomes that much easier. Yeah, and again, in terms of like things like line breaks, there's a convention in the coding world where lines should only be like 80 characters long. And I think R even has like a little little marker here. And that's just an ancient formatting thing based on screen space and widths and whatnot, but it's a totally fine rule to keep in mind. So if you've got lines that are running all the way along the screen here and off into the distance, it's just going to be harder for a human to read. So you could do things like, you know, when you're calling a function, put each little variable on its own line, and then you can just see what's going on there. Cool. That value is applied to that variable, that for that, that for that. Whereas here, and if there's more arguments and they're not explicitly named, just takes that extra second, that extra bit of cognitive load to figure out exactly what's going on here. Whereas here I can it just reads like a list. Here are my variables. Here's what I've assigned to them. Cool. Yeah, let's move on. But here it takes me an extra second, you know, and if this is going on, I might need to scroll across the screen, figure out what's going on. So by all means, use space as well. To help us humans read it a little bit. There are things we can do to make things to make our code self-contained, and we will enact some of these, and I can get more hands-on in the coming weeks as well. But some simple things like using, well, simple in one sense, but if you've never thought about this, it can be a little bit weird to get used to. Things like using relative file paths, not absolute file paths. And what that means, so this is a file path. So this is an instruction to my computer as to how to find this file called feeding data, called feedingdata.csv. This is an absolute file path. So it's saying on Tom's computer here, right? So look in my C drive, then there's a folder called Tom's computer that's like some at the base of my project somewhere. Within that, there's a folder called projects. Within that, there's a folder called feeding experiment. Within that, there's one called data. And then in that is where you'll find feedingdata.csv. That's an absolute file path. And that's not going to work on anyone's computer except mine, because no one else has c./Tom's computer /project/. Those things don't exist unless I share my entire computer with someone. So that'll never run off the bat. If I just give someone that script, it'll fail at the first line, and they'll have to figure out what I've done and tweak it and you know, fix that up so it runs on their computer. And it won't run on my computer in 6 months when my computer dies and I change it, or I change a folder name or whatever. So keeping with our theme of nice, tidy, self-contained projects, what you can do is assume, so like here's our R folder in our nice self-contained directory. You can use relative file paths. So what we do is just assume, we could assume a couple of things. There are a couple of conventions. One is that our script is always being run from within this little folder called R, or that you're at the root directory of your project. Two different ways to do it. Both are perfectly fine and sane. But what that means then is that we can just use these things called relative file paths. So if I shared this entire project with someone, which is the goal, and someone could just be me 6 months away, and they opened up that R file and they ran this, and then that would actually just work for them, because what this is saying is, well, if I open up my R script and it's sitting here, these two little dots on a Mac mean go up some level. So let's just take a step out. So now my computer is just looking here. Hop into this folder called data. Here's my folder called data. In that folder called data, you'll find a data set called feedingdata.csv. And because I'm sharing this whole thing with someone, that'll always work on their computer or my computer off into the future, because they'll always be able to hop back one level, hop into data. There's my data right there. It doesn't need c./Tom's computer / whatever, because this is what's called a relative file path. It just means relative to the directory that, in our context, it means relative to the directory that this file is sitting in, our R script is sitting in.
Tom, is that a Mac specific thing or not?
It's not the two dots. No, it can. I always, to be honest, I actually keep getting mixed up. No, I think that should be right. There's also a trick that we can use. There are little actually packages that we can use to help it make sure it works over Mac, Windows, Linux, all of that stuff. So I forget, because I haven't used a Windows in so long, but that's a fair question. I need to double check.
Laura says it works on Windows. That's
oh,
great.
Cool. Yeah, oh, great. So no, I think that's pretty standard. There is, yeah, there's some difference, and I forget it every time. I think there are some differences, but we can struggle. We'll hit them because I'm sure some of you are on Windows, but by and large, it's pretty consistent. And there are packages which you can play with that actually make it even easier to do these, to handle these relative paths, so you don't have to think too much. But yeah, it's a general, like, nice one. So that's yeah, that's a lovely general self-contained little rule that we can go with there, and we will enact that in coming weeks. This is actually kind of a repeat of 1 and 2, really. We can keep it all started. There are little packages that actually help you with all of this stuff. So with this, we can use a package called here, and I can show you how that works. Or you can just remember these rules and try and enact them yourself. But same with the styling. There's actually a little file. There's a package called styler. And it's actually, if you use RStudio, you can run it. And what it'll do is take any code that looks like this, and it just enacts some of those basic rules that we just went through, and it tidies up your code. It splits lines if they're crazy. It adds nice readable spaces to things. And so with a click of a button, you can kind of just tidy up your code a little bit as well. And to save yourself, space and cognitive effort and whatnot, just knowing that that exists can be nice. I wonder if I've got that. So in RStudio, oh no, I don't have it installed. Oh, there you go. Okay, we'll play with it in coming weeks. But if you actually install that package and you use RStudio, it actually just becomes an option in the menu, in the add-ins menu. And you can just hit, yeah, style this file, and it'll turn this into this. So what it's done is, here you've got 2 bits of code, 2 independent bits of code on the same line. And you can do that in R. If you separate them in the semicolon, it'll run this and then it'll run this, but it's bad practice because it's hard to read. So it's going, well, that's bad practice. So I'll split those 2 up. You've also got no spaces, so that'll run perfectly fine, but it's hard for a human to read it. So it's just added like punctuation, like we would in a book or whatever. And yeah, easy, push the button, your code looks a bit nicer. It won't comment anything for you, so we still want to go through and have comments and all that, but nonetheless, it's totally, it's a real improvement. Oh, cool. And okay, well, touching back, I guess we've chatted a bit about open science and what that might mean. Got some practical steps and hopefully, a few tips and tricks on what it is to just tidy up and organize our digital lives to make it useful, first and foremost, for us into the future, and, for sharing and for other people, and laying some of that groundwork. I think, yeah, and so next week, we're starting to we'll boot up RStudio and get into the nitty-gritty. We'll start to learn a bit of data wrangling with this thing called the tidyverse. So how to really manipulate code and summarize it, get our data into different shapes and get some of that key information from it. Yeah, are there any general questions at this stage? Or thanks so much for coming along. Yeah, I'll have to go check my own sock drawer now and reflect on that as well. But yeah, and also just, get in touch anytime, just emails and stuff if there's anything in the meantime.
That was great, Tom. Really lots of super hints that, yeah, I wish I'd thought of many of those things right at the beginning when I was starting to compile directories and code. So thank you. I really enjoyed that. It was really useful.
Cool. I'm glad to hear it. Good luck with your Halloween festivities.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. All right. Well, lovely to see everyone. Questions, just email or save them. We'll catch you next week if you're around, or whatever. But yeah, cool. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, wherever you are. And I'll see you all again soon.